Yeah, it's good to be here, and as a little bit of just a little bit of housekeeping, a little bit of update. You know how in the past we've said we travel all around to different churches. It's really good because there's a bit of proof. We met Chris and family down there in Christchurch, and like he said, we know Becky's sister and family very, very well, and we could talk a lot of stories about that, but that's not for today. While we were there in Christchurch, we also arranged with the Redemption Church there that they will be having our speaker, Gracia Burnham, which we should come up here. Yeah. And I thought I'd just mention that to you here because part of our work that we've been doing is organising this nationwide tour for her, and I've got some brochures out over the back table for you, and I've just put down one of the venues that she'll be at. The nearest one to here is Windsor Park Baptist Church on Sunday, March 24 at 6:30. Jump on our website. She's all over the country. We've got 13 venues that she'll be speaking at, and she is worth listening to. What they went through as a couple, 13 months as hostages by terrorists, and in the release of that, her husband Martin was killed. And she tells the story of a great God, a forgiving God, a loving God amongst all of that. It's really worth hearing. She'll be selling her books and signing those for anybody who wants that as well. So if that interests you and that venue's no good, have a look on our website. All the venues are there, including Redemption Church in Christchurch. Now, last time that we were here and shared, you may remember that I mentioned something of we had a young girl, Esther Jenkinson, that we had met at Impact, was going to come to interface with us, and she did, and she absolutely enjoyed that. And so what we did while she was there, we actually videoed her and some of the others and put together a promo that we've been using for this year in June, July. And so I thought I'd show you that so you can see, because of the connection with Impact and because we mentioned she was going. So here's just a bit of an overview of what she saw of it and how we are promoting that for this year.
You may have heard about the Interface short-term missions program held here in Papua New Guinea and run by Ethnos New Zealand and our global partners. It is designed to show young adults why we need long-term missionaries and gives them a taste of what it's like to stick it out till the job's done.
From what I've seen at Interface, they give you a really good training and foundation so that if missions, tribal missions is what God calls you into, then they fully prepare anyone.
Interface is a 6-week tertiary level course in church planting amongst ethnic people groups. It includes time in the classroom learning the principles of tribal church planting, how to learn an unwritten language, courses in translation principles, as well as classes on finances, support roles and cultural awareness.
We learned how to learn an unwritten language. When I was seeing how the missionaries were talking to the nationals, I was so surprised because it was just the same and they learned how to speak it. And when we learned it in class, we first had phonetics. And it was quite difficult to get all the sounds, but at the same time I really enjoyed it. And I love to see their culture at the same time and see how they live.
There are classes in Tōkisen and plenty of opportunities to practice with national language helpers. The Bible is taught chronologically, the same way it is first presented by missionaries to the people groups they're working with.
Chronological teaching has been really amazing when they put it all together in order and show the mainstream and the main point that is all pointing to Christ all throughout the Bible. It's just been really cool to see it out like that.
tribal location to see a young church plant. Our week is spent with new believers, hearing their stories, worshipping with them, and just experiencing life in a remote tribal village.
The missionaries were telling us about how the fear just gave them, like, pushing them down because they have the Holy Spirit. Jesus just broke the chains, and it was just so amazing to see that they are free, and it was just an eye-opener for me.
Inspiring for me to be able to see the believers out there, the mature church that is growing out at Hewa, and just the passion that the believers have for God, and just to see that this really works.
And they've got such a heart for evangelism themselves. They want to reach out to the other tribes and let them have the light as well.
What an intense yet impacting week that is. Experiencing interface may show you that you have an aptitude for languages, a heart to build relationships with people from a different culture, or show you how you could fill a vital support role. If God has given you an interest in missions, why not come and experience firsthand church planting in some of the most isolated places in the world?
It's all just been amazing, from the teaching and meeting all the different missionaries who live on the field and hearing their stories, and then going on a side trip and seeing how it actually plays out in real life, and yeah, just everything has been amazing, even the food.
Come and participate in Interface. You won't go home the same.
It really is a fantastic way to show interested people what it's like to plant churches cross-culturally and how that they may fit. And one of the things that we've been praying about and wrestling with as a couple, as an organisation, how to get this out to other people, other churches, that to get pastors on board to see this as a valid thing, that hey, this could be what we need for our church to get people into missions. And so we talked to Matt Johnson about this down at Riverbend, and he has jumped at this idea, and this year he's sending along Maria Worry, who is part of the missions committee, some of you might know her, for this very purpose, to see how they can use this, implement it in their church. So naturally, we're pretty excited about that for her. We're excited for Riverbend, and we're very excited for us as Ethnos New Zealand. We also have a young guy from Northland who is going to be signed up. He is signed up to come with us this year, and registrations are still open, so please pray with us that the Lord would bring us to the people that He wants to come along with us. We'd love to meet them. Okay. Now, did you know that the Auckland Sky Tower is the tallest structure in the southern hemisphere? At 328 metres, it's actually 4 metres taller than the Eiffel Tower to the tip of its mast. It would have to grow another 88 metres to reach the height of what the New York Twin Towers used to be, but it's only a baby compared to Dubai's Burj Khalifa, 828 metres. That is an impressive tower, and at that height, that is 2.5 times the height of our tower, and there's our one to scale. So ours is just a very little baby tower, isn't it? I remember watching the early stages of the Sky Tower being built, and from the Victoria Street construction fence, I could look down and I could see this huge hole that they were digging. And it turns out that this foundation is 16 metres down into the bedrock, and that's a huge foundation. It needs to be, because the tower's been designed to be supported against more than 200 km/h winds and magnitude 8 earthquakes to withstand that. As we all know, foundations are important, right? The Leaning Tower of Pisa is a great example of things are not done right or things go wrong. Anyway, this morning let's leave all this and let's go to Caesarea Philippi at the time that Jesus trudged that dusty road with his disciples, and we're going to look at a very different sort of building and its foundations. We're going to go to Matthew chapter 16 verses 13 to 20. We're going to start reading in verse 13. And so Matthew 16:13, and I've got NIV, which I'll read up on the screen here. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others, Jeremiah or one of the prophets." "But what about you?" he asked. "Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by man, but my Father in heaven. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." Then he warned his disciples not to tell anyone that he was the Christ. Okay, this is a very famous passage where Peter makes his great confession of faith, and also how Jesus responds with the revelation of how he will build his church. And there's so much in there, what we've just read, that we need about 4 sermons to do justice to that. So this morning I'm just going to skim through part of it. It will probably look a little different because it's going to be in a missional context this morning, based on the statement, "I will build my church." So, like any building project, we're going to look at this in 3 areas: the foundation, the construction, and the completion. So let's go straight to the foundation. Jesus, knowing all along that there was confusion about who he was, as we saw in verse 14, he then gets to the real point with his disciples and says, "Who do you say I am?" And then Peter speaks up in verse 16, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And that is a statement that is absolutely jam-packed with a study on its own. But just briefly, what Peter is saying there in those words, Christ is the anointed one. He's been promised from the beginning. He's the Messiah promised throughout all the Old Testament prophecies. And here he is on Israel's stage. He's the Son. He's part of the Trinity. He's the promised one to ascend the throne, not just ascend from a dead ancestor, but through the living God who lives from everlasting to everlasting. Peter got it right. Many around Peter at that time had some pretty good answers. They even had a religious sound to them, but they were miles from the truth. And I like how this pastor said it here. Some said he was a rabbi. They ignored him. Some called him a prophet. They treated him like other prophets and didn't do what he said. Some say today he's a good teacher, a religious leader, a great historical figure, or a tragic revolutionary. They want to dismiss him, avoid him, bury him. Trouble is, Jesus won't stay dead. He keeps showing up and asking, "Who do you say I am?" So how about us? See, the way we answer that question will determine how we live in this world. If we see him as the great teacher, we will apply everything that he teaches us through his word, and we won't just pick and choose the bits that we want. If we see him as just a great miracle worker to give us the next good thing that we demand for a more comfortable life, our self-centeredness is going to prevent us. It will lock out much of what God had planned for us. We'll miss out on the ultimate joy that it is to serve him and the rewards that are in the next world for us. If we see him as the Christ, the Son of the living God, we'll be living under his authority as a servant to the greatest king, filling some role of service in making disciples wherever we happen to be. That is a natural outcome for any of us who have become fellow heirs of the Christ, the Son of the living God. The disciples knew him firsthand, and they came to this amazing conclusion: Jesus is God in the flesh. He is fully human and fully God. They saw his divinity shine through in the glory of the transfiguration. They saw his divinity shining through in the raising of Lazarus from the dead. His testimony that he existed before Abraham. At the same time, they saw his complete humanity. It's evident when he rebukes Peter. Remember when he angrily cleanses the temple? When he weeps by the tomb of his dear friend Lazarus. He's the God-man, the Christ, the Son of the living God. And that's all part of the foundation of our Sky Tower of faith. It's a foundation that's designed to withstand the more than 200 kilometre-hour winds of false teaching that abounds around us. It's the foundation that's designed to withstand the greater than 8 magnitude earthquakes of compromise and tolerance that we see all around us in our degenerating culture. The source of all this foundation for us is revealed the same for us as it was for Peter. And Jesus said it this way in verse 17. Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by man, but by my Father in heaven. In spite of all the corrupt teaching of the Pharisees and Sadducees that is talked about at the beginning of this chapter, we didn't read that, but you can check that. In spite of the confusion among the people of the truth of who Jesus is, it was revealed to Peter by the Father in heaven. He didn't get this from man. He didn't get it from a book. He didn't get it from the internet. It came from above. And right there is some of the reinforcing skill and the foundation of how Peter arrived at his answer. The truth of who Jesus is revealed by the Father in heaven. We've locked up, have we? Yeah, okay. You're not going to get the pictures we had, but sorry about that. So God's been working in Peter as Peter had had time with Jesus. Peter's eyes were opened by what he had seen, by what Jesus had taught, and also by the fulfillment of many of the ancient prophecies. The Father's revelation process brought forth fruit. Peter was blessed because, just like Jesus said in John 6:65, no one can come to me unless the Father has enabled him. See, the Father had drawn him during this time that Peter did 3 years of life with Jesus. And you and I, we haven't had that kind of physical interaction to get drawn to him. We haven't had the opportunity like Thomas. Remember Thomas? He was able to see Jesus' hands. He was able to put his hand into Jesus' side. And when he did, he emphatically said, my Lord and my God. But we're the ones that Jesus refers to as he addressed Thomas when he said, blessed are those who have not seen me and yet have believed. And we can only believe because the Father has revealed this to us. See how blessed we are? Like what Jesus says next to Peter in verse 18. So we are blessed. Because understanding who Jesus is and how that's been revealed to us, that is the foundation for our faith. And I like what Jesus says next to Peter in verse 18. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. Right there, that is the first mention of the church. The Greek word ecclesia, which means called out ones or out-called. So this is not about buildings. It's not about Jesus building buildings on rocks. But it's all about Jesus calling out a people into an entity or into a body. And like a building has to happen on the correct foundation, otherwise it's going to end up looking more like the Leaning Tower of Pisa. And we would have had a picture of that. But so to avoid looking something like that, Jesus is very particular how he will build his church. It is on the rock, not a literal rock, but a rock-like foundation that Jesus exposes using a play on words to make a significant point. You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. See, what Jesus is doing here is he's using Peter's Greek name, Petros, which means a small stone, a stone for throwing a fragment off a bigger piece. And then he draws this against Petra, meaning a large stone or rock, a cliff or bedrock which cannot be moved. And I like how E.W. Bullinger exposits this thought to distinguish what's at play here. And in today's English, you are a Petros, a vacillating, unstable man. No one can build on you, but on this Petra, this rock which human wisdom cannot reveal, but which is revealed only by God himself. Upon Christ as the Son of God, I shall build my assembly. See, this rock that Jesus builds his church on is the truth of who he is, revealed by the Father to Peter, and of course to us. That's the same for us today. Right there is the foundation of our faith. Now, looking at the Sky Tower, once that foundation was laid, that's when the construction commenced. Same thing in verse 18. Jesus now begins by building more on the revelation to his disciples. And I tell you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. The first thing we notice here is the building methods that God uses in the construction of us as individuals. When something is grasped, then more follows. So here, because Peter has understood the foundation of who Jesus is, that can now be built on. Just like the Sky Tower in construction, each new level is built on the previous. And for Peter, at this time of his confession, the cross was not yet revealed to him or the others. See, that begins following the verses of our text here, immediately after this revelation, and continues to be built right on through until the time of Jesus' ascension back to his Father. By that time, the cross was no longer a mystery to them, but fully understood as the only way to the Father. A few more verses later, Jesus goes on to reveal more about true servanthood and sacrifice. And then in the next chapter, he goes on and we see a small glimpse of the future glory of Jesus as he's transfigured on the mountain. That's just some of the next levels of development that Jesus had for them as individuals. And just like for us, Jesus always has more that he wants to build into our lives, right? But for this to happen, we have to be learners, don't we? And it's often harder when we've been a Christian for a long time or the older we get. Second thing in this Petros-Petra playoff here is something of the outward construction. See, Jesus makes it clear that Peter will become instrumental in establishing the church. Throughout the New Testament, we see that Christ established his church on the apostles, on their teaching, on their writing of Scripture, and on their establishing and organising the church. So in effect, Jesus is building his church in a privileged partnership with people. Again, look at our Sky Tower. Was it just one man who built that? Or was it just one company? No way. There was hundreds on site, and then there was all of the sub-trades, there was all of the supply and service companies. Thousands were involved in that. And that's the idea of this partnership that we're talking about for the Lord to build his church, and especially missions. We see how this joint effort metaphor is unpacked several times through Scripture. Here we've seen how Jesus said, I will build my church, but in 1 Corinthians 3:10 we can see that Paul and the apostles built it. Jesus is the foundation of the church, as in 1 Corinthians 3:11, but the prophets and apostles are also the foundation in Ephesians 2:19 and 20, or Revelation 21:14. Peter is given the keys here, but in Revelation 1:18 and 3:7, Jesus has the keys. Isn't it an amazing truth for us? The creator of the universe, the architect and builder of the church, would allow someone like Peter to be part of the founding of this. Poor old Peter, his life's been laid bare for countless generations for all of us to see all his failings. But by contrast, who are we? God would use us in any part, and yet that's exactly what he does. As weak as we are and insignificant compared to Peter, God has a part for each one of us as he builds his church. Now, I like what Hudson Taylor said. God uses men who are weak and feeble enough to lean on him. See, the local church is tasked for outward construction by its members through outreach and witnessing and all that it takes behind that to support that. In missions, the outward construction of the church is far more diverse. And as Ethnos New Zealand and our global partners, we have highly trained missionaries that will learn at least one, probably two languages. And then they'll convert that into written form, probably for the first time in history. Literacy teachers preparing people to read so that when the scriptures get translated, they'll be able to read and study that for themselves. The cross-cultural Bible teacher who brings the gospel message clearly to avoid syncretism. When we lived out in the jungle, because we were so remote, we relied on others who would buy our supplies. We relied on pilots who would bring them out to us along with project materials or medical supplies for our people. We relied on IT guys to keep our computers up to date and running in very difficult conditions. We relied on guest house managers for a clean and affordable place to stay when we were in town, or when we brought people out that needed hospital treatment. Administration people to help us stay legally in the country with visas and so on. Accountants so that our support didn't get muddled with the other missionaries, so that we actually got it. We saw how God sent us funds through the local church around New Zealand and individuals. And we saw how God raised up people who would seriously pray for us, our co-workers and the people we were living and ministering amongst. And those last two, the supporters and the prayers, are right here in New Zealand, based right at home, equally a part of what God was doing. There's many other roles that are needed in missions, and if people come to help for short term or long term, chances are that whatever we're doing for a living here, if not that specific occupation, at least those skills that we have could be used. All in a partnership with the one who is building his church. So this morning, are we in personal construction mode, level by level, as we learn the next thing that God has for us? And what about outwardly? What are we building into? See, after all, we're being built up to build out. And you mentioned that just before communion. If we aren't a part of what Jesus is building locally or globally, maybe today is a good time to have a think and look and see how can we become a part of what God is doing, especially among the nations. Come and talk to Judy and I after. We'd love to help you see where you may fit, how God could use you as a co-worker in the construction of his church. Lastly, let's have a look at something of the completion of the church. In any building project, anticipation of completion is what drives all of those involved, and it excites people watching, right? Certainly the opening day of the Sky Tower had been anticipated. At last, this day was arrived through many challenges and no doubt many setbacks along the way. Any injuries or industrial disputes that happened, they did not stop the structure reaching its completion. So too with the church that Jesus is building. It was planned for way back in eternity past. And as he unrolls the blueprint here before his disciples, he makes the assurance the gates of Hades will not overcome it. Now probably the most common interpretation of this section of scripture would be the gates are figurative for power of Satan and his forces, the powers of hell, who are opposed to anything and everything that God is doing. But since Jesus has defeated him and sin and death, those powers cannot prevail against the church. And a number of our English Bibles translate and use the word hell here instead of Hades, and that helps drive us to that conclusion. And there's some really great theology there. But there's a problem. See, with that interpretation, hell is not a good translation for Hades. Hades is the Greek equivalent of the Hebrew for Sheol, and both of which always mean the grave, the unseen place of the dead. The gates of Hades is a figurative way of stating that those of us who make up the church, we're all going to pass through the gates of death one day, but this is just temporary. It's a temporary loss. It will in no way diminish or overcome the church because there's a resurrection out ahead. We'll be raised from the dead just like Jesus was, and his church worldwide will be reunited with him in our new glorified bodies. John MacArthur explains this as a promise of resurrection that fits the context of the passage, because Christ would soon tell them not only about his death and resurrection in verse 21, but also about coming persecution and death of his followers in verse 25. The highly respected Greek New Testament authority on Greek New Testament, Spiros Zodhiates, himself a Greek, says similar things. Many well-known commentators and scholars hold to this view. Jamieson, Fawcett and Brown, A.T. Robinson, E.W. Bullinger, Matthew Henry, just to name some. Nevertheless, Satan's opposition against the church is very real, and it does apply when seen in context with verses like Ephesians 6:12, where it says, "For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, and against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms." See, because Jesus conquered death and the grave, all satanic power, none of these evil forces that Satan tries to use will win out. He'll try his hardest, and we see all that, don't we? Against the attacks against the church. We see brutal persecutions against God's people, especially in other countries. But Satan cannot overcome the church because it's built firmly on Jesus. As the old hymn says, "On Christ, the solid rock I stand, all other ground is sinking sand." See, it's a guarantee of completion that Revelation 7:9 describes as a great multitude that no one could count, from every nation, tribe, people and language, standing before the throne and in front of the Lamb. That's a long anticipated accomplishment that Christ has been working millennia towards. How good is that going to be? Can you imagine the gratitude of that multitude, all of us who were there at that time, worshipping Jesus for the sacrifice he did to get us there? Can you imagine the delight that Jesus will have his full body of believers all together in one place at one time, outside of the sinful environment that we're all stuck in now? That's something of what completion is all about. And we get the idea of completion with our Sky Tower these days. Any of us can enjoy a view of Auckland while we have a nice meal above the city, or if we're crazy enough, we can sky jump from it. We can do those things even if we had no part in any of the construction in that. So how much more for us, how much more the joy, the fruits of completion, if any of us are a part with Christ as he's building his church locally here or overseas in missions. Judy and I were privileged to be a small stone-sized part in all that it took to help our co-workers get the Agusan Manobo New Testament to print, and I have a copy of that here. First time in history that those people got the Word of God in their language. It's a joy and fulfillment that we found is what you'll often hear from many retired missionaries. I wish I was young enough to do it all again. God has used countless people throughout Ethnos, New Zealand, and our global partners all around the world who are all about a thriving church for every people. Collectively, we've had the privilege of seeing more than 1,200 churches planted among 259 people groups. The completed church looking something like this Tala Underg church that some of you may know of, Jason and Shirley Birkin, who are New Zealanders who have invested their lives into in the Philippines. Or like this Siawi church in Papua New Guinea. Or perhaps a little bit different like the Guahabu people in Colombia, even though guerrilla activity has forced them out of their village. There's many other examples we could give of what God has brought about to his completion. So what about us? Are we personally at completion stage yet? And of course we know the answer is no, that won't happen until glory. But as far as the lessons that the Lord has for us, are we allowing him to grow us? Are we working towards some aspect of completion with Jesus as he builds his church? See, one day, the only thing that any of us will have left here to show for our life on earth will be a tombstone. All it will have on it is our name, our birth date, our date of death, maybe a Bible verse, or somebody liked us, maybe something nice about us, but that's it. A birth date, a dash, a death date. And all that shows, that little dash, shows the entirety of our life here on earth. So what will be behind our quick dash through life? As we've seen today, Jesus said, I will build my church, and it is squarely set on the rock-solid foundation of who he is and what he has done for our entry into it. It's a truth that is only revealed to us by the Father himself. Construction is a process for followers of Jesus, for as we grow, to the point that as we do grow, we are invited to become co-workers with him as he builds his church. And then the completion is guaranteed, because no matter what happens in the process, nothing will overcome it. Whatever part God may have us serving in today, let's be encouraged this morning and not give up. Sometimes it's hard going, but let's keep on. We are on the winning team. And if we're considering moving into something new that God may have for us, let's go home with the fact that he will use any of us who are willing to be part of building his church. And thank you for the chance to share that with you.